What's going on, everyone? Tyrone May here, Himalaya ride enthusiast and entrepreneur. I'm back here once again as I bring you chapter 13 from my book, The Himalaya, where the strobe flashes and the mirror ball spins. Continuation of my story on how my fascination with the Himalaya ride started, which leads me to my journey to one day called one of those classic rides of my very own. So if you'd like to purchase a copy, you get on Amazon or my online store. You get some Himalaya fan-based merch, just like this. Web address is shown below the screen. So without further ado, I'm going to take this time to give you chapter 13, titled, The End of a Tradition. 2 months after the fair ended, I started to spend more time trying to improve my model of the Himalaya. One Saturday afternoon, I finally purchased another small spinning disco light from the same flea market where I had bought the first one. As soon as I brought it home later that evening, I began installing both lights on the custom designed stand in front of the model. What a beautiful sight it was when tons of colorful spots swirled all over the inside of my newly improved model. Toward the end of the year 1998, I had made more changes to my model by creating new scenery. The inside panels had a dark blue background with some unique cutout mountains that were placed on it. They were similar to the blue sketch mountains from the last scenery I had designed. Early that following year, I found out that the Delaware State Fair would have a new carnival that would be coming to town. Personally, I had mixed emotions about the whole thing. I didn't know what to think. I liked the carnival that had always come every year since I could remember, so I really couldn't understand why they were changing it all of a sudden. At the same time, in the back of my mind, I was curious to see what this new carnival would have in store for the State Fair of 1999. Whatever carnival that was coming to replace our fair, I hope it would have the Himalaya just like the last carnival that had served the town of Harrington, Delaware throughout the years. The fair just wouldn't be the same without that ride. Ever since I heard about the new carnival, I couldn't help but think about what kind of rides I would see when the fair got to Harrington. I even had dreams almost every night about the new state fair I'll be visiting. Early that spring, weeks before my 20th birthday, I had made plans to get myself a tattoo based on my personal interest in the Himalaya. A few months prior, I spent days trying to come up with a perfect design for my future tattoo. I wanted something that wasn't too big or too out there. I finally came up with the perfect design for the tattoo. It was a picture of 3 sleigh-shaped cars coasting down the undulating track with a mountain-like background. After I took a second to look at what I had drawn, I immediately thought it was perfect. For days after I thought up my design, I visited over every tattoo shop in Delaware to seek the perfect price. I showed my design to every available tattoo artist at every shop I visited, but most of them asked between $150 to $200, which was a bit more than I expected. Finally, around March, I ran into my old high school friend Mike, who told me that he had his own tattoo business at his house. Since high school, Mike had an interest in tattoos. He was also a pretty good artist, and now he finally had his own legitimate tattoo business at his house, license and all. And I thought, this guy came right in time. I told him that I was interested in getting a tattoo from him, and I showed him my design. Mike not only told me that he would be more than happy to give me my tattoo, but he also gave me a much better price, $75. I immediately jumped on the offer and I made the appointment on my birthday, May 1st. About 2 days before the big day, my car suddenly wouldn't start. So my stepfather called a friend of his who happened to have his own auto shop. The following day, my stepfather towed the car over to the shop to have his friend work on it. Now that I was told that the car would be fixed and I could pick it up early Saturday morning, which was my birthday. But unfortunately, 1999 was one of those years when anything could go wrong, it did. I got up around 7 o'clock Saturday morning, got dressed, and ready to start the day. Minutes later, my stepfather told me that the shop wasn't open. First, I thought maybe it was too early for the shop to be open. But after waiting an hour, my stepfather called again, and the shop was still closed. Hours later, I found out that the shop was closed for the whole day, which was not normal. Usually Saturdays was the busiest for the shop, so I just didn't understand why the shop was mysteriously closed that day. I mean, it wasn't a holiday, and there wasn't any kind of emergency that I could tell. I just couldn't understand it. Not only I could not get my car back, I had to call Mike to cancel my tattoo appointment. My entire birthday plans was ruined. Mike told me that the next day would be much better time to stop by because he had some things to do that day anyway. He told me that he would schedule my appointment for the next day at 3 p.m. Though I was pretty disappointed in how my birthday was going, I told him that would be fine and I would see him then. The next day I called Mike around 1 p.m. to make sure that he knew I was coming by to get my tattoo. Mike told me that he had already had me scheduled that day for 3 o'clock, and he gave me the directions to his house, which I wrote down. Since I didn't have a car, my mother had to drive me to his house and drop me off. We left the house an hour early so we could follow the directions to Mike's house. We showed up at the house at 3 o'clock on the dot. My mother told me to call the house when done getting my tattoo so she could pick me up. Before I had a chance to knock, Mike saw me and opened the door and let me in just as my mother drove off. Mike showed me to his room where he had already had his tattoo equipment ready for me. At the time, Mike lived with his parents, who gave him a lot of support in his tattooing career. As I gave him my design, he asked me where I wanted my tattoo to be located. I wanted it to be across the right side of my chest, so Mike told me to take off my shirt and have a seat while he made the stencil of my design. After Mike finished the stencil, he shaved off the area where my tattoo would be located and placed the stencil on me, and left the imprint of the design on my chest. Before Mike got started with the tattooing process, he suggested me that I look in the mirror to make sure I was happy with the design and where it was located. After taking a minute to look at my design, I gave him a thumbs up. It was time for the painful process to begin. Mike put a fresh new needle into his tattoo gun and prepared the ink with the colors I requested, red and blue. Mike started the tattoo by tracing the stencil imprint with black ink. After all the outlining was complete, he then colored it with the red and blue ink. Getting the tattoo hurt like hell at first, but I started to get used to the pain as time progressed. About 2 hours later, Mike had finally finished my tattoo. I looked in the mirror and realized that the tattoo looked so much better than what I expected. I mean, every detail was just perfect. Mike had made a few minor changes with some of the detail from the original design I gave him, and they made the tattoo look amazing. After I took my first glance at my new ink, I called my mother to come by to pick me up. While I was waiting for my ride, Mike suggested that I show his parents the work he had done on me. Mike guided me to the kitchen where his parents were having dinner. His parents were really impressed with the outcome of my new tattoo as I told them what it was all about. After my show and tell, Mike and I went back into his room where he gave me some Neosporin and placed a large bandage on my tattoo so it could heal. Afterward, I put my shirt back on and paid him. My mother arrived and waited for me while Mike gave me a list of instructions on how to take care of my new tattoo. As soon as I got back home, I went to the bathroom and looked at my tattoo in the mirror. I was blown away by all the detail. 2 months later, it was July, and it was almost time for the state fair. A few days before the fair opened, my father, my stepmother Cheryl, and the rest of the family invited me to go to Ocean City with them. I hadn't been there in 2 years. About a month before their invitation, my friend Hilton, who I had met earlier that year, informed me that he had just visited Resort Town. He claimed that Trimpers Amusement Park had a new Himalaya ride, which was the same type as the original, but it was brand spanking new, scenery and all. I wasn't sure whether to believe him, but I wanted to see for myself. On my way to Ocean City, I had a gut feeling that I would be seeing the same Himalaya that had always been there. But at the same time, I wasn't so sure because it had been a while since I visited the park. As we neared the inlet, I looked out the window and noticed that this so-called new Himalaya looked the same as the ride that had been there for years. We finally made it to the inlet parking lot where we made our final stop. My father put some quarters in the parking meter and we went our separate ways. My stepbrother Tony and I started heading toward the boardwalk on our way to the rides while she came with my father and Cheryl. My stepsister Charisse hadn't been available to come with us on a trip because she was out of town. Antonia and I reached the park within minutes and I spotted the Himalaya. It was the same Himalaya ride that had always been there, but had been repainted. The Himalaya and the original artwork were still the same, but it was all restored to look like new again. Now, I don't know who took the time to repaint every single detail of the entire ride, but whoever it was did a pretty good job. Every detail on each scenery panel was perfect, just like the original artist who had painted it. I had always wanted to meet and get to know the artists who painted all the Himalaya rides that had been made, and I hoped one day that would happen. Though the Himalaya was still there and the artwork looked even better than before, there was still something that was a little off about the ride. It could have been my imagination, but the Himalaya didn't seem to be going as fast as it used to go. Or maybe I had forgotten, since it had been a long time since I rode this particular one. I also used to ride the Himalaya at the state fair. Also, the mirror ball didn't look like its usual perfect self. It was cracked all over and a lot of mirror pieces were missing. The mirror ball also shook every time it spun around when the ride was in motion. Other than those two observations, the ride itself was in great shape, and I was happy that the old ride and its original artwork was still around. I was ready to ride, so Antonio and I went to the ticket booth in front of the Himalaya and purchased a whole sheet of tickets. After we paid for our tickets, we boarded the ride. As the ride started, the operator asked us if we wanted to go faster. Of course, everyone screamed for him to speed up the ride. The operator announced that he was taking us faster, but the ride didn't accelerate like it once did. It was only going about 9 revolutions per minute. It felt a little strange going backward with such little speed because it just wasn't normal for such a ride. Minutes later, the ride stopped and it was time to go the other way. As the Himalaya began to travel forward, it picked up a little more speed than it had when it went backward. The operator told us to hang on tight because we were going to go faster. Once the ride reached full speed, it was a little faster than it had been. It didn't go as fast as it used to, but it was fast enough to still catch a thrill. Even though this particular Himalaya wasn't as fast as it used to be, my feelings for the ride never changed, as Antonio and I returned to the ride a few more times in between trips to the other rides. It was still daylight when we left Ocean City a few hours later, and even though I wish we didn't have to leave so early so I could see the Himalaya all lit up at night, I was really looking forward to the new state fair beginning in a couple of days. Later that Thursday afternoon, after working all day at the rink, I was anxious about going to the fair. I still had no idea what to expect because of the new carnival that was taking over. I went home and took a good long shower, picked up my best threads, and left the house around 6 o'clock that evening. When I finally reached the fairgrounds, I decided not to look over to the midway until after I stopped the park. After I found the parking spot, I stretched my legs and started heading toward the midway. I looked over and saw some familiar rides including the Giant Wheel, the Pirate, and the Enterprise. But I also spotted a Music Express ride, but it was a smaller built model, which was something I'd never seen before. I was hoping that it wasn't the only Himalaya-type ride I would see at this new fair, as I tried to look for the real thing. As I walked through the midway, I suddenly spotted a full-size Music Express, but it had a different name which apparently started with an H. I couldn't really tell what it said. I continued to walk toward the opening gate where I saw the next letter in this ride's name. It was an I. Right then I wondered if they named this ride what I thought. But then when I saw the third letter in this name, which was a T, now, I knew this ride wasn't called Himalaya. The name of this ride started with the word hit, but I still couldn't figure it out. I finally made it to the opening gate. It took me through the midway where I saw the ride in full. It was indeed another Music Express ride, which apparently had a unique name, Hittin' 2000. I thought it was a pretty interesting looking ride. Just like any other Music Express ride, it had a bunch of flashing lights of various colors, but this one was a bit different than any other Music Express I have ever seen. The panels on this Hittin' 2000 ride had a painted color scheme with flashing neon music notes instead of actual detailed scenery, which had been on many other Music Express rides. I was very disappointed that this new carnival didn't bring an original Himalaya, but I was willing to give this new ride a chance. I purchased some tickets and hopped on. The Hittin' 2000 started off pretty slowly, just like any other ride, and then it started to pick up a little more speed. Suddenly the ride accelerated a lot more than I expected. The ride seemed to have really good speed, but surprisingly, it wasn't at its highest speed. The operator got on the microphone and asked us if we wanted to go faster. The crowd screamed, "Yeah! Sit back and hang on tight as the Hittin' 2000 take you super fast," the operator said as he cranked up the ride to its fullest speed. Take it from me, this was one fast ride. The Hittin' 2000 was just as fast as the Himalaya from the previous carnival, but the undulating three-hill track on this ride was slightly different than the original Himalaya ride. But just like the Himalaya, it had a siren, a strobe light in its tunnel, and a good mic man. I was very impressed with it, but at the same time, the fair felt really strange without the Himalaya being there, so I knew right then and there that the Delaware State Fair would never be the same again. Nevertheless, I wanted to give this new carnival a chance. After all, it had brought some pretty good rides. After my experience on the Hit in 2000, I wanted to try out the smaller Music Express that was in the middle of the Midway. The Hit in 2000 only operated in forward direction, but the smaller built Music Express operated in reverse. Now, I hadn't seen this ride's whole ride cycle or how fast it went, so I knew I was in for a surprise. This particular Music Express may have been small, but it was no kiddie ride. This small ride was just as fast as the Hit in 2000 or any other full-size Himalaya Music Express type ride, but only traveled backward. This ride went so fast I couldn't keep my locks out of my face throughout the whole ride cycle. I spent most of the evening riding the 2 Music Express rides until I decided to take a break to visit my friend Hilton over at the grandstand. About a week previously, Hilton had mentioned that he would be participating in the demolition derby, which took place over at the grandstand, so I had to go see for myself. I walked over to the fence and tried to look for him, but I couldn't see very much. I only saw a bunch of old, beat-up and painted cars lined up and ready to do some serious crashing. Seconds later, an announcer on a loudspeaker introduced the first line of cars as they started heading toward the main area where all the action would take place. As soon as the first event started, the next load of cars lined up in preparation for the next event. About 30 minutes later, I spotted Hilton, who was behind 4 other cars. After he spotted me, he hopped out of his car and came by to talk for a minute while waiting to be called into the main area for the next event. We discussed the new carnival that had made its debut that evening. I mentioned to him that it was a bit different than what I was used to, especially since the fairground had been covered in concrete earlier that year. I said that the new carnival had brought some great rides like the Hit in 2000, but I missed the original Himalaya like crazy. After he shot the breeze for a few minutes, the previous event was just about to wrap up, and it was time for the next load of cars to take their place. Hilton put his helmet back on and hopped back into his car after asking me to hang on to some of his belongings until he returned. After the announcer presented the next drivers, including Hilton, the crowd cheered loudly as they started the countdown before the crashing began. The crowd cheered loudly, almost drowning out the intense sounds of the loud motors as the cars began crashing to each other in every angle as I looked on through the fence. Even though I thought it was cool that I had a friend who was in such a huge event, deep down I started to feel just a hint of jealousy toward him. Don't get me wrong, the way I felt wasn't really against Hilton. I had never really had the guts to get involved in anything, especially when I was younger. Every time I tried to participate in anything different than what I was used to, something always happened at my expense, and I always end up looking like a fool in front of everyone. I had always felt like I couldn't do anything right. It was the main reason that I always stayed to myself, especially when I was in high school, where I'd been through more than my share of problems. It was also the reason I had never been to college, and that had always been one of my biggest regrets to this day. And besides, even if I wanted to get involved in something, especially like the demolition derby, my family would talk me out of it right away. Having listened to their opinion was the downfall of still living with my parents after the age of 18, especially in a neighborhood surrounded by other family members. After Hilton returned from his event, we started heading toward the Midway as he told me everything that went on. Moments later, a scruffy-looking guy appeared looking for Hilton. The guy told Hilton that it was time for him to start heading back to the grandstand to get his car so it could be fixed up and ready for the next event in a few days. After Hilton went on this way, I started to make my way back over to the Hit in 2000 to get my mind off my personal issue. This time the Himalaya wasn't there to heal my wounds like during last year's fair, so now I had to rely on a totally different ride. It just wasn't the same. I left the Midway later that night thinking about everything from the huge change in the state fair to the whole Hilton situation that I just couldn't get out of my head. I was at the point where I was really getting sick and tired of my same old sheltered lifestyle. I was 20 years old and I felt like I had missed out on everything in my life. About 90% of the people I knew only knew me from my job at the roller rink, which was fine and all, but little did they know that I could do so much more with my life. I was willing to try out anything that was new and different that I found interesting, just like when I worked at the fair in 1997. I went home with a lot on my mind. I found myself having little trouble sleeping, which became a major problem because I knew how to get up early for work that next morning. I finally started to doze off around 2 a.m., and I didn't wake up until 7 o'clock that morning when my alarm clock went off. I forced myself out of bed and got ready for work. On Fridays during the summer, a huge camp with more than 100 kids came to the rink and stayed from 9 in the morning until 3 o'clock in the afternoon, so I knew I was in for the long haul. After that portion of the day was over, everyone cleared out the rink. It was time for the big cleanup process, which usually took about 45 minutes to an hour. After a long hectic day at work, I was ready to go back to the fair and not dwell on everything for a change. Once the rink was back in order, I punched out, got my paycheck, and made my way to the bank. As soon as I cashed my paycheck, I went back home to freshen up before heading back to the fairgrounds. I usually pick out my best gear to wear, such as a good casual shirt and my best pair of shorts or jeans. But this time, however, I just wasn't in the mood to pick out any kind of fancy attire. So I just decided to sport a decent pair of shorts and a white tank top, better known as a wife beater. I left the house again around 6 o'clock that evening and started to make my way toward the Harrington Fairgrounds. I spent most of the evening riding both the Hinton 2000 and the smaller but fast Music Express. However, the Hinton 2000 was the ride I rode the most out of the two rides because it was larger and had a lot more speed like the Himalaya, not to mention the colorful flashing lights. Later that evening, I decided to attempt to meet some of the workers on the ride. There was one guy in the control booth working the microphone and controlling the ride, and another guy across from the booth on the opposite direction side of the ride. He was not a mic man, but he really knew how to work the crowd. He was like the hype man of the ride. He would yell at the top of his lungs toward the speeding crowd, "Everybody get your hands up, let's go, let's go!" This guy obviously loved his job. It reminded me of myself when I'd done the same thing when I worked both the Thunderbolt and the Himalaya at the fair in 1997. Toward the end of the night, I finally took the time to meet the over-enthusiastic worker. I told him that he was doing a great job on the ride. He introduced himself as Booker while happily giving me a handshake as I introduced myself. Booker asked me if I was coming back to the fair anytime soon. I told him that I'd be back in a couple of days. 3 days later, I went back to the fair, and the first place I went was the Hinton 2000 to meet my new pal Booker. When I walked closer to the ride, however, I noticed that Booker was surprisingly missing in action. Seconds later, one of the other workers who remembered me gave me a welcome back handshake. When I asked him where Booker was, he told me that he was no longer at the ride. They had to let him go. Even though I was pretty disappointed, I didn't want him to get into details. So instead, I just hopped on the ride and tried to enjoy my day off at the fair. After riding the Hinton 2000, I walked around the midway until I spotted a familiar face. I spotted none other than Booker, who was walking aimlessly up and down the midway. I walked to him and said what's up, but Booker didn't look like his usual energetic self. He seemed upset and kind of depressed, but he was happy that I cared enough to take the time to approach him to see how he was doing. Booker told me about his situation and why he had to part with his job that he loved so much. Basically, he was being accused of something that he claimed he didn't do, and before he knew it, they gave him the old heave-ho. I had only met Booker a few days before, so I didn't know him that well, but part of me really felt sorry for him. I'm the kind of person who likes to meet new people everywhere I go, but sometimes I tend to get too attached, something that had always been a problem. I've been that way ever since I left all my friends when I moved from my old neighborhood in Dover. Ever since then, I've always felt so alone. I decided to hang with Booker for the rest of my day, simply because I felt that we both needed someone with whom to talk. As we continued to walk around the midway, Booker told me that he was going back home to his family in Brooklyn, New York, to work at another Himalaya ride in Coney Island. He also revealed to me that he too had a dream of one day buying a Himalaya ride of his very own. Booker told me that the original Himalaya ride had been his all-time favorite ever since he was a kid, and he had always thought about having one of his own ever since. Booker told me that about his plan, which was to save money to invest in his own Himalaya ride. It felt great to finally meet someone with whom I had so much in common and who had the same desires and the passion about the Himalaya as I did. I told Booker about my quest to own a Himalaya ride someday as well. Booker told me to go for it and try to save up money little by little. I told him about the last time I tried to save up for a Himalaya ride, which didn't work so well for me. So I told him I would be better off trying to win the lottery instead. Booker and I hung out for the rest of the day, riding on most of the rides on the Midway. Later that evening, we had a visit from two girls who happened to know Booker. They asked if they could hang out with us. Booker and I both agreed to invite them along. Things turned out perfectly for a change, especially when it came to the dreaded two-person ride because it was the four of us and we could all ride together. When we rode the Enterprise, Booker rode with one girl and I rode with the other. Though they were Booker's groupies, the girl I ended up riding with seemed to have a thing for guys with dreadlocks because she kept playing with my hair during the beginning of the ride. It was cool. After riding the Enterprise, Booker then introduced me to this weird-looking ride called the Tornado. It was a spinning-type ride, hence its name. This ride was like a hanging version of the teacups or one of those sit-and-spin type of rides, except the gondolas were suspended instead of attached to a platform. Each gondola had a wheel in the center that could be turned to make the seat spin as fast as the riders wish. This ride also had strobe lights, which gave the ride some extra cool points. After we left the ride, the girls went their own way, as Booker and I stayed and rode some more during the last hour before closing. Before I left the fair, Booker and I wished each other luck on our journey of owning our own original Himalaya ride someday, and we shook hands one last time. I gave him my address so he could write to me, but I haven't heard from him since that night. As I learned throughout the years, friends do come and go, but people like Booker were a dime a dozen. Because he was never judgmental, and again, he was someone that had with whom I had so much in common. I managed to go back to the fair a few days later. It was the last wristband day. While walking down the Midway, I spotted Hilton working at one of the rides. I took the time to chat with him, and he mentioned that he was going to travel with the carnival for a while. I was pretty shocked. Hilton was the one friend with whom I'd hung out the most since the beginning of that year, so I hated to see him go, but I wished him luck and told him to come back soon. I spent most of that day riding the Hinton 2000 along with a few other rides until the fair finally closed for the night. As much as I've ridden the Hinton 2000 since it arrived, I still wondered if I would ever see the original Himalaya ride at the fair again, or were those days long gone and in the past? And there you have it, guys. That was chapter 13 from my book, The Himalaya, where the strobe flashes and the mirror ball spins. I hope you enjoyed it so far. Be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel and let me know what you think. And if you'd like to buy my book, you can buy it on Amazon or my online store along with tons of fan-based merch. I'll be back on here next month with chapter 14. So as we say in the Himalaya world, keep that mirror ball spinning. Take care.